sold to allies, but they ended up in enemy hands. Some of America's Gulf allies are accused of transferring US-bought weapons to rebel groups in Yemen. Will the controversy pressure Donald Trump to stop supporting the Saudi-Emirati-led coalition at war in Yemen? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. Now, Amnesty International says the United Arab Emirates has secretly armed rebel groups in Yemen with advanced weapons bought from the US as well as European manufacturers. The rebel groups include the Giants, the Security Belt and elite forces, which are trained and funded by the UAE. Amnesty says a wide range of US-supplied armoured vehicles have ended up with rebel fighters. They've also received mortar rockets and guns bought by the Emiratis. Amnesty says the rebels are accountable to no one, and some have committed war crimes.
We have not authorized Saudi Arabia or the Emirates to retransfer any of this equipment to other parties on the ground in Yemen. And as you are well aware, when we do provide equipment, whether it comes government to government or commercially provided, that the recipients do have to agree to certain stipulations on the use of those, and that we do have monitoring and enforcement mechanisms.
Well, the UAE and Saudi Arabia are yet to respond to the allegations. Let's bring our guests into the show. We have joining us from Sana'a, Nasser Arrabyee, a political commentator. In London, Patrick Wilcken, a researcher on the arms trade, security and human rights for Amnesty International. And in the US, by Skype, Lawrence Korb, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense and Senior Fellow at the Center for American Progress. Welcome to you all. If I could start with Patrick, it's a fairly detailed report, some would say quite shocking. How did you reach these sorts of conclusions?
Well, we examined open source material, visual material, looking at the arsenals of particular militia groups, including the Security Belt and the elite forces and the Giants that have been recently engaged in the al-qaeda offensive, and we matched the types of weapons that we were seeing with transfer data, the sort of published data that states register on their arms transfers, and we saw certain patterns. While much of the weapons that are currently being used by militia groups in Yemen are legacy weapons, they're old weapons that have been in the country for, prior to the conflict. We are now seeing some disturbing patterns of what we would say is deliberate diversion of weapons, particularly armoured vehicles. We see a wide variety of US, not just US, South African armoured vehicles, but also small arms from various European states, including Bulgaria, Belgium, Serbia. We've seen mortars, Serbian mortars, and Singaporean truck.
But how do we know, if I could jump in here, Patrick, how do we know who transferred those weapons to these militia groups on the ground?
I think that's an open question, and a question that the Emiratis and in some instances the Saudi Arabian authorities have to answer. The Emiratis have been on record saying that they are supporting these militias. It's well known on the ground that they are supporting these militias, and has said that, for instance, the Giants form part of coalition forces and are under their command in a sense. And I think this is worrying, particularly from the United States perspective and any other supplier states, because usually Western states are quite rigorous in their the stipulations they put on any arms transfer. They have end-user certificates which specify that arms cannot be passed on to third parties. And so this looks like, to us, the Emiratis equipping and training these forces and handing on equipment against the very strict stipulations that the US, for instance, would put on any arms transfer.
Well, talking about the US, let's take the perspective of Washington, D.C. Lawrence, is it possible that an organization like Amnesty International, simply by viewing videos and open source material, can come to this conclusion, and yet US intelligence, other Western intelligence are unaware that their weapons are ending up in the hands of groups they haven't authorized?
Well, U.S. intelligence knows this. Again, to make it public would undermine a lot of the arms sales that the administration is pushing.
So why are they looking the other way, Lawrence?
Because the president wants to continue to sell arms to those countries. He claims that this is good for our economy. He claims that this basically is a way to strengthen our alliances there. And it's not just Amnesty International. CNN, the American cable network, the leading cable network, had a much more damaging story, not only about the UAE, but to the Saudis giving stuff that's ending up in the hands of Iran, which Trump claims is our biggest threat to the area.
Well, then the claim then, Lawrence, I mean, how does that go down in Washington, perhaps credibly, that this is in the US interest if, as is being claimed, some of these weapons even end up in the hands of groups affiliated to al-qaeda, which is anything but pro-Western, obviously, or pro-US?
No, it undermines American security. And I think what you've already seen is the Senate had passed a resolution saying we should stop providing aid to the Saudis and UAE, not just because of this, but because of the horrible human catastrophe that's going on there. And I think this will give impetus to even more strict legislation in the House of Representatives to stop the arms sales completely.
Interesting. Let's bring in the perspective of Nasser. You are, of course, in Sana'a, which is controlled by the Houthi movement. Some of these groups which have received weapons, Western weapons like Security Belt, Elite Forces, the Giants, give us an idea of what a difference that makes on the ground, the fact that they have these types of Western weapons.
Well, there is no difference at all. This is something that is not new to Yemenis at all. Most of the Yemenis here know that Qaeda ISIS fight alongside the US allies with the Saudi-Emirati forces. This is something very clear. And also the weapons and the money that gets to the hands of Qaeda ISIS here, they get to their hand openly as equipment for fighters, as salaries for fighters. This is something that is very known. For example, let me give you an example. Most or the majority of the forces of the Saudi-Emirati forces in the western coast of Hudaydah are the so-called al-Wiyat al-Amaliqa, that is the giant brigades. This is, these people or these forces call themselves Salafi. Everybody knows that they are in a way or another linked directly to al-Qaeda and ISIS. Also, there is also a battle or a brigade in Ta'z called the Abu al-Abbas Brigade. This is also receive money and weapons, I mean the US weapons and the Saudi and Emirati weapon openly as salaries and equipment. So this is something not new at all. Also, there is something more, that some of the leaders of these people, of Qaeda ISIS, are based in Riyadh and in Abu Dhabi. And this is something known. I mean, some of them also are designated.
And ask
designated
Lawrence,
by the US.
Well, you've mentioned the US. Let me bring Lawrence in. So the sort of picture which is being painted there for us by Nasser in Sana'a is that you have groups linked to al-Qaeda, whose leaders, he says, even based in the capitals or cities of US allies, which are receiving weapons, money, support from US allies, which means, if you follow that logic, the US is funding some of its worst enemies, al-Qaeda affiliated groups.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. The same thing has happened in Syria. A lot of the weapons that we initially put in there to fight Assad ended up in the hands of groups affiliated with al-Qaeda. And what's happened here is both the Saudis and the UAE are so fixated on dealing with the Houthis that they're willing to make a short-term concession to groups like al-Qaeda. And as just pointed out by our colleague here in Sana, the fact of the matter is that the Saudis have had these type of groups in their own country for a long time. I mean, the attacks of 9/11 came from primarily people from Saudi Arabia.
And that doesn't raise eyebrows in Washington, D.C., Lawrence?
Well, it does raise eyebrows, but not with this administration, who's so fixated on dealing with Iran and increasing the arms sales. Where did President Trump make his first overseas trip? It was to Saudi Arabia. And look how he's handled the Khashoggi incident. He has not held Saudi Arabia accountable.
Let's bring in Patrick back to the discussion. Tell us the practical human rights issues that come with allowing Western weapons to end up in the hands of some of these militias. What does that mean in terms of conduct of war there?
Well, I think I'd just preface any comments specific to those militias by saying that all parties to the conflict, whether they be the Emirati Saudi forces or the Houthis or allied militias, have from the outset committed a whole range of very serious human rights violations, including the indiscriminate bombardment of civilian areas. But specific to these groups, Amnesty has done some very detailed research on the ground in southern Yemen, talking to detainees and their relatives from a string of so-called black sites, secret detention centres, where they were held and guarded by some of these militia groups. And the allegations that came from those interviews were quite shocking. They were subject to torture, sexual humiliation. They were deprived of food and water. There was enforced disappearance, a real grey zone where the families were looking for relatives but unaware of where they were being held. And there were, killings of criminal suspects. So I think, this is where the nub of the issue for us is, Western states, including the US, have to be aware of the risks of complicity that they run if they are prepared to arm countries such as Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. We have been calling on a complete cessation of arms supplies to the coalition from the outset of the conflict, just on the grounds of their own conduct. But this adds another dimension. And as your guest in the States has said, this is not, this is a reality that has happened in many different countries in the region. He mentioned Syria, but Iraq is another classic case where Western arms went in and then were diverted or stolen from Iraqi stocks. We had the growth of Islamic states and also the popular mobilization units, which were also accused of very serious human rights violations, including the killings of thousands of young Sunni boys and men. So it's an endemic problem, particularly in the Middle East, and states prepared to continue to supply have to be aware that there is this risk, and they're also going against some very strong domestic regulations, but also EU-wide
we'll pick up
regulations.
on those regulations in a second, Patrick, but you touched on a point which I want to take back, because the Amnesty report does talk about how, well, it documents quite thoroughly how it sees the flow of weapons coming from the UAE to some of these groups. On the ground there in Sana'a, Nasser, how much control does the UAE have over these militias?
For the control, it's a control of it's a sort of control for receiving the weapons and receiving the money, and then they say we are fighting Houthi. This is the only thing, but they are not under the control of United Arab Emirates. Neither in the western coast nor in the south also. So they are the common things between them only to fight Houthi, not more. But they have their own agenda and they have their own ideology, as everyone knows. And maybe the names they have some different names now. Now they are calling themselves the Alwiyat al-Amalika, the giant brigades, or Abu al-Abbas brigades, as I told you. This is just the names, but they have their own agenda, they have their own aims,
right.
They have their own goals. So we can't.
So you would agree with the Amnesty characterization that they're
has a lot of
unaccountable.
control over them.
They don't give an account to anyone.
Yes, of course. They are uncontrolled.
Okay.
They are not under the control, and they.
All right.
And they are not.
Let me bring in Lawrence if I could, because I know time is getting quite short. Lawrence, could there be legal implications for this? I mean, there are rules in the US, in the EU, about transfer of weapons, particularly to groups which are accused of committing war crimes, right?
Well, there's no doubt about there could be legal implications, and obviously, I think what the Amnesty report plus CNN is going to get the Congress to say we can't sell them any arms anymore, regardless of what they claim, and we won't provide them any assistance, particularly for the bombings that they've had, refueling or providing them these precision-guided weapons anymore. Obviously, somebody could bring this case to the International Criminal Court, but that obviously is a whole different issue, and the United States doesn't even belong to the International Criminal Court.
Okay, let's take that point back to Patrick in London then. Your report seems to link, for example, you've looked at certain configurations of weapons and you've said that could only have come from this source because this is the only source that's bought that configuration of armored personnel carriers and, I don't know, gun turrets, right? Is that sort of evidence, do you think, going to make some kind of solid legal case?
Well, I think this is a very interesting and fast-moving area, looking at the legal liabilities both of states and companies in arms transfers. Because, as you said, there are very strict rules. There is the EU common position, which prohibits transfers if there's a high risk of them being used for human rights violations. There's the Arms Trade Treaty, which was adopted in the end of 2014. The US is a signatory. EU states have ratified, and interestingly, the United Arab Emirates is also a signatory, one of the few in the region. Which is legally binding internationally, and likewise connects, prohibits the transfer of arms where there's a substantial risk.
All right, so Patrick, you and Amnesty, you've documented stuff. What do you do with your evidence that you've gathered so far?
Well, we have been campaigning for many years to try and stop arms supplies to the coalition. And we'll be continuing to do so, taking our report and evidence to Capitol in the various EU countries mentioned, and through our chapters we have officers around the world lobbying in the States and in other countries. We also have a strong presence at the Arms Trade Treaty Conference of States Parties, which discuss these issues, and we were going to continue to press states for them to live up to their obligations. We are also in the UK involved in a legal case against the UK government against their decision to send arms to Saudi Arabia, which has been bought by a campaign group here in the UK, the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, and we are supporting that case, which is going to appeal shortly. So there are many different routes of campaigning and legal actions that we are pursuing.
There is a big question mark right now over the flow of arms, at least from the West, to some of the allies of the US, Saudi Arabia and the UAE for use in Yemen. Nasser in Sana'a, what does the continued flow of weapons, and we should point out as well there are allegations of flows of weapons from Iran as well, not just from the West via Saudi Arabia and the UAE. What does that continuation of flow of weapons mean for prospects of the ceasefire, or at least the truce which was agreed to for Hodeidah?
Well, of course, the more the weapon, the more the war. This is something very, it goes without saying. You know, if the parties who are sending these weapons want this war to end, they must stop it, of course, because without these weapons, there is no war. But unfortunately, the problem now is that these advanced weapons end up in the enemy of US and UK and France and all the West. That is al-Qaeda, ISIS. This is something that is al-Qaeda, ISIS have never been dreaming of such things to happen at all. Now they are receiving these things easily with the Saudi and Emirati money, and with a big cover, political cover and media cover, that they are not hiding at all now as they were in the past at all.
Right.
So they are now, it's a golden time for Qaeda, ISIS and all kinds of these militants.
All right, we've just got about a minute and a half left, so I want to give it to Lawrence before we wrap up. You've spoken about action by Congress. How likely do you think it is that we will actually see an arms embargo imposed by Congress on arming Saudi Arabia and the UAE, for example?
I think in light of the Amnesty report and the CNN report, which got a lot of coverage in the United States yesterday, Congress will pass it. Whether the president will veto it and whether Congress has the 2/3 to overturn that, I think, is a different issue. But there's no doubt about the fact that there's growing support in this country to stop providing arms to the Saudis and the UAE, even before these reports came out, because of the horrible humanitarian catastrophe that's happening in Yemen. And when people can then bring up the fact that you're arming groups associated with al-Qaeda, or that this technology gets back to Iran, I think that might be the game changer.
Talking of game changers, it would be, Lawrence, though, quite a game changer if the US cuts off weapons, right? The sort of military impact that would have on the conflict would be immense, would it not?
It would. And don't forget that the United States had Secretary Mattis, before he left, said, you've got to get this, solved by June, when they had the peace negotiations up in Sweden. So hopefully this will accelerate that process.
All right, let's thank our guests very much for their thoughts on this one. Patrick Wilcken, Nasser Arrabyee and Lawrence Korb. And thank you too for watching. You can see the show again, of course, anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here. For now, it's goodbye.